Cool. So, hi, I'm going to also do the thing of being like, look at all the faces. It's really lovely to be doing like a real life conference again and being able to like see all your smiles. So today we are going to be doing a bit of magic. I'm going to be teaching you all a magic trick. Don't worry, it's not a really bad staged card trick. It's like a little bit of browser sleight of hand. So we're going to learn how to animate the impossible. And I know impossible animation sounds kind of hard, and it's like 6 o'clock, and it's the last talk of the day. But it's like 2 a.m. for me in England time, so just... but we're not actually animating impossible things, because otherwise that would be a really, really short talk. So what I actually mean is animating some really tricky UI stuff involving responsive layouts, DOM restructuring, and different position properties without causing layout reflows. But that's a bit wordy, so I just went with animating the impossible, a little bit catchier. So yeah, as Phil mentioned, I work at GreenSock. We make GSAP, which is a really popular animation library. You can use it to animate pretty much anything. So like UI elements or SVG or Canvas or Three.js, pretty much anything with a number, you can just chuck at it. And we deal with a lot of browser bugs and oddities so that everyone else can just kind of do the fun stuff. I've actually done loads of talks about GSAP before, but this is the first one that I've done since they hired me. So it's very exciting. Who's used GSAP before? Loads of people. That's like probably all my workshop peeps from yesterday, isn't it? Yeah. It's good to do a workshop the day before. So yeah, you can animate pretty much anything with GSAP. I really love to animate SVG, and that's what I do most of my talks and workshops on. Vitaly let me animate this little prawn antenna and the biscuit and stuff, which is great. And yeah, I just generally love messing about with SVG animation, like making funny things like this wobbly jellyfish, and like fun typographic SVG animations. But that's kind of tricky for most people to get into their day-to-day websites that they're working on. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about UI today, but a little bit more about SVG. I basically think that SVG is like a really great place to get started with learning about how to animate on the web. And there's like two main reasons. Number one, it's just super fun, and you can make wobbly jellyfish and stuff. But also, it's really predictable in SVG land. So basically, different slide. Come on. Boop. OK, so yeah, SVG graphics basically exist in their own little universe. And they've got their own coordinate system. So if you pop this open, there's like a view box here. And this basically says that the view box is 100 SVG units wide and 100 SVG units high. And if we want to animate this little planet guy, we can just do like a little GSAP tween, and we can say, hey, GSAP, get this planet, and then I want you to animate it over to the right. And that's like the whole width of the SVG. And we can offset that a little bit so that it's right on the right side. But then that's the same no matter how small or how large that SVG is. It's just consistent and predictable. There's no like layout in SVG land. It's just a coordinate grid, and then you plot elements on it, and there's no flexbox, there's no absolute positioning, there's none of that stuff. So it's really nice for just kind of getting started with learning about animation. Yeah, I'm getting off track. This isn't an SVG talk. I'm going to chat about UI. But the roundabout point here is that the world that SVG elements live in is really predictable, but the world that HTML elements live in, Miriam had it right when she called the web an infinite and unknowable canvas. That's basically it. So we've got an absolute ton of different devices. We've got phones, we've got iPads, and we've got laptops, and we've got those silly phones that fold in the middle for some reason. And SVG has SVG units. Like, we don't just have website units. There's like tons of different units to measure things. We've got pixels and ems and rems and viewport units, and now container units too. And that's awesome, but it's a lot. Like, elements can be fixed or relative or absolute or sticky. They can be children of flex containers or grid containers, or inline or block. Like, it's a whole thing. And because of this environment that UI elements live in, UI animation can be a bit fiddly. And sometimes it gets avoided entirely. And I think that's a huge shame, because UI animation can be a really integral part of understanding an interface for people. So why is it so important, Cassie? Good question. I will tell you in a bit, but we're going to watch a little video first from one of my favorite people, Richard Wiseman. He's a magician and a psychologist, and he writes amazing books, and everyone should go read his things. But anyway, the video.
Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now, the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now, Sarah could have selected any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table. And what I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, an excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table, give a little click of the fingers, and you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all of the other cards have got red backs. And that is the amazing colour-changing card trick.
How many did you spot? Did anyone spot one person? One. So most people probably didn't spot any of the changes at all, did they? Yeah, have you seen that other video with the gorilla? I think some people, yeah. So it's the same thing. So when I was researching this talk and very unsuccessfully trying to teach myself a legitimate magic trick, I stumbled on some overlap between some UX research by the Nielsen Norman Group and the psychology of magic. Basically, we're all a lot less observant than we think we are. In the backs of our eyes, we have 2 types of light-sensitive cells. We've got cones and we've got rods. And cones, these little, it looks very Illuminati, doesn't it? The little triangles underneath the Illuminati thing, those are our cones. And cones are really sensitive to light and color, and they're mostly collected in our central vision. And then in our peripheral vision, we have like a few cones, but it's mostly rods, the little line guys. And the rods are more sensitive to movement. Our peripheral vision basically shouts like, hey, over here. And then our central vision will scan and catch up and then gather all of the details. And when these things get passed up to our visual cortex, more neurons analyze the stuff in our central vision than the peripheral vision. The peripheral vision is basically full of loads of gaps, and our brain just guesses. It makes some educated guesses, and then it fills in the blanks, and it's not always filling them in very well. So we do actually see a lot less than we think. And this is called inattentional blindness. And magicians take advantage of this to do like sneaky magic stuff in our blind spots while our attention's elsewhere. But this brain quirk can also lead to frustration with interfaces for users. So if something unexpected gets added outside of the user's focus, it can often be missed. So it's like when you're filling in a form, you fill it all in, and then you click submit, and it doesn't submit. And it's only when you start going up the page and looking at all of the fields that you notice that there's an error state. But we can take advantage of these motion-sensitive rods in people's peripheral vision by using animation to give little bits of feedback. So like this little animation, it shows that the plant's been moved down into the basket, which is at the bottom of the screen, and it's like, hey, it's over here when you're ready to pay for it. And if the supermarket that my mum was using during lockdown had this animation, I wouldn't have had to Zoom with her for 3 hours to explain to her where her shopping was. So I'm a big fan of these kind of little guiding animations. Another type of visual issue that we have is change blindness. So change blindness is a little bit different. It's a failure to notice an obvious change. And I can't show you this experiment because it's a little bit epilepsy-inducing. But UCI did a study where they showed people basically spot the difference images. And they showed them on screen, and they cross-faded them and asked people to find the differences. And they were like, yeah, okay, they're there. And then they did another one where they just flashed them and then showed a screen of white for a second and then showed the next image. And people really struggled to find the differences when there was this visual disturbance in the middle. And I find this really fascinating because this is basically how page refreshes work on the web. Like, we have a page, we click a link, there's a flash, and then the page comes back again, and the users have to reorient themselves and scan the whole page and figure out what's changed and what's the same, and like it's difficult for people. So yeah, good UI animations, like well thought out page transitions and motion, can really help reorient users and inform them about change. So I like to think about UI animations as fitting into like one of these three categories. So we've got exit animations, it's like something leaving the DOM, entrance animations, something being added, and then persistent animations, which is something going from like here over to here. And I'll let you have like one guess about which one is the most difficult. Why can I not say that word today? But since we're on a whole magic vibe, we're going to do vanishing, appearing, and levitating. So yeah, enough slides. Let's make something vanish. I'm going to have a little bit of water. So if we're trying to make something vanish, we're going to move it from this left hand over to the other hand. And now this is website world, so we don't have the handy like SVG units to work with. So we're going to say, hey GZAP, animate this card over to the other side of the screen. So we can use like viewport width. That will work. Shot off a bit, let's correct that. So, other side, hooray. Another thing that we can do is we could do, we can do like functional values, and we can go window in width. Is it capitalized? Let's try that, hooray. Okay. So after we've got it over to the other side of the screen, we can make it disappear with opacity, but opacity is just going to visually hide it. And sometimes you don't want that because you want something to be hidden for screen readers as well. So there's a little property that we've got, like a little shortcut called auto alpha, and that does visibility hidden as well. But then you could also do like on complete. Let's do this. On complete, and then we can say like this, targets. I forget the syntax for this, so I'm just looking. And then we can remove that element, and then it will just be yoinked out of the DOM at the end of the transition. So that's like a vanishing animation. Awesome. So let's make something appear. So making something appear. First off, we want this to be over on this side of the screen, and then we're going to make it appear in the other hand. So we're going to say GSAP2, and we'll get the card. And then we're going to animate it over to the other side of the screen. I'll just copy and paste. It's late. Let's do this. So we'll animate it over to the other side of the screen. And we're going to say opacity 1. We'll put this opacity all the way down to 0 here. And then magical appearing card. It's overshot again. I need to remember X%. There we go. So magical appearing card. But the annoying thing about this is it's not in the right place in the DOM. So if we resize the screen, it's just there because of transforms. Like, it's not actually in its proper position. So the best way to animate things in is to put the element in its final position in the DOM and then animate in from transformed values. So we're going to say animate in. Let's do viewport widths. Animate in from opacity 0, and let's put a duration on so it's a little bit longer. There we go. So then it appears, but it ends up in the right place in the DOM, which is what we want because screen readers need to traverse things. And yeah, so like from tweens are great because they immediately render the element in the transformed place. So that's a little bit of GSAP. Another solution, it could be, and this is what a lot of people do when they're animating elements, if they want to get the element from one side of the screen to the other, is to animate like left. So if it's at left 0, we could animate left 100%. And this is what I see a lot of people doing for like DOM transitions. And I see some people pulling faces in the audience, and rightly so. So let's talk about browsers. So after all your JavaScript and your styles are processed, the browser goes through 3 steps to get all of the lovely pixels on screen. So first is layout, and this is where the browser like calculates where everything is, gets all the positioning, and you don't see this bit happening. This is just like the browser thinking about stuff. And then all the pixels get painted onto layers, and then those layers get popped on top of each other to create the website. And animation-wise, it's really cheap and efficient for the browser to move these layers around. But if we animate a layout property like left or top or width, the browser has to reflow the page and go through all of these steps again. So first layout, and then paint, and then composite, which is quite expensive. And if we animate stuff like background color, the browser hits the paint step and then has to trigger composite again, which is less expensive, but still not too great. But if we use transforms and opacity for animation, we just trigger this final composite stage. And that means we get buttery smooth animations and less work for the browser, and good stuff all around. So yeah, I'm just going to skip to... So yeah, let's look at another slightly more challenging challenge. I'm going to close that tab so it doesn't confuse me. Here we go. So a slightly more challenging challenge. We've got a card here, and we're going to toggle a class. We want the card to be full screen. So we're going to swap out the position. We're going to change it from a relatively position element inside a Flexbox container to a position fixed element. This is another thing I see people trying to do. So they're like, okay, cool, CSS transitions, that's what they're for. So I'll just say, like, hey, CSS, can you do this transition for me? But what happens is it pops it out of its position in the document flow, and then it pops it back into fixed position, and CSS tries really hard. It's trying, but it's not quite what we want. So how do we animate impossible challenges like this? Well, with an animation technique that's a little bit of magic. It's a little bit like browser sleight of hand. So what we have to do is we have to make it appear to the user that the element hasn't moved when we've actually moved it to a completely new place and then put it back again. And we're going to do this browser magic trick with Flip. So it's a technique that's been around for a while. I still see tons of people battling with animation that could be solved with this technique. Paul Lewis was the first one to coin the phrase from Google, and David Korshid and Sarah Drasner have written about it loads as well. So there's loads of stuff out there if you want to read up on it. It's a handy mnemonic that stands for first, last, invert, play. So let's take a look at how this works. So first up, we're going to grab the first position of the element and get the size of it. And we can do this with getBoundingClient-rect. So this returns an object that gives you the position of the element in relation to the viewport. And then we're going to move the element to its new position in the DOM. And we take measurements again, and then we calculate how far the element's moved. So this is the sneaky bit. This is happening in the layout stage. So the user can't actually see this. And then before paint happens, we pop it back and paint it to the screen in its original position. So it looks like it's never moved, even though it's in a completely new place in the DOM. And then finally, we can remove those transforms, and it animates the removal of those offsets. So it's just magic. It's awesome. So wall of code time. This is what a simple flip animation looks like in vanilla.js. So first getting the position of the element, and then we're switching it up and putting it in its last position, and then finding out the offsets, calculating the delta values, popping those into a transform, and then very last, we're removing the transforms and then using a CSS transition to animate the offset. And that's really great for like simple flip transitions, but there are a lot of quirks with like nested transforms, and if you're trying to flip child elements and you've got container elements, and grid and flex containers can be a little bit tricky too. So at GCEP, we've made a flip plugin that kind of smooths over a lot of those, yeah, there we go, smooths over a lot of those browser issues. So let's have a little look at it. Where are we? Cool. So we're going to do the same thing, but this time we're going to say, Flip, can you grab the state? Cool. Flip gets state of the card, and then we're going to toggle that class, and then we're going to call flip from, which is the same as the from tween earlier that immediately renders things. So we're going to say flip from state. And now, whee! So now it's smoothly animating between those two positions, even though it's been taken out of the document flow and made position fixed. And it's capturing it on the fly, so it's interruptible, which is also really nice. So, right, make it more impossible. So let's have a little look at a slightly more impossible demo. So this one, can everyone see the code? Yeah? Can you still see it if it's a little bit smaller? Yeah, okay, that's good. Awesome. So in this demo, we're actually reparenting this card. So if I take a little look in the console, you can see that the card's in the right hand, and if we click on it, pop into the left hand. So we're actually taking the element out and putting it in a completely new div. So let's add, oh, thanks past Cassie, awesome. It's like 3 in the morning for me. It's not the right time to be doing live coding. So if we use flip to do this, ta-da! We can even add a little spin to it, and it rotates around. So the best way to understand how this works is taking a look in the DOM. So we can say paused, and now if I click on it, it doesn't move. If I take a little look in the DOM, oh wait, let's refresh that. Wait, I'll take that off. It's very hard to open the inspector and also a code editor on my tiny laptop screen. Let's try and squish everything. Okay, so we'll go pause true, and then if we take a look, oh, CodePen, where is everything? Can you see it? Where are we? Spot the div. Boxes. Inspect. There we go. Okay, cool. So we've got the card in the left hand here, and then we've got the right hand, and if we click on it, it hasn't moved, but you can see that it's actually in the right hand now. So that's where the card actually is in the DOM. And then if we take that off, then it will actually play. So that's the browser sleight of hand. And I feel like looking in the DOM, it feels a little bit like looking behind the magician's curtain. It's just, it made me really excited when I first learned about this technique. So, yeah. I'm getting overexcited and losing track of where I am. Yeah, let's go back. Right, so basically here we're reparenting this card, but there are lots of frameworks, not naming any of them specifically, that don't like reparenting stuff and just re-render everything and make stuff really complicated. So I've also got a little function here that's deleting the element and then re-rendering it in the right hand. And we can do this by adding a data flip ID. So these get added automatically by flip. It's how like we keep track of where the elements are. But if you're going to take something out of the DOM completely and then replace it, and you want to animate between those two elements, as long as it's got the same data flip ID, it will still work. So we're inserting a new element here. And then our one that we're going to yoink out, yoink, I'm as bad as full of beans. So our element that we're taking out, I've put a data flip ID on as well. And then we can just delete and replace instead of reparent. Well, that hasn't worked. Did it reload? Data flip ID. Oh, we need to do targets. There we go. Okay. Because it's popping back in. So if we give this a run, hooray! So that's like taken the card out of the left hand and appended an entirely new element into the DOM in the right hand and still animated between them, which I think is just pretty amazing. Let's make it even more ridiculous. Let's do some like nested transforms. That didn't work. There we go. Right, so we're gonna transform those container elements and take the element out of the left hand and append a new element into the right hand, and it still works. So it's just, it feels like it's completely impossible, but we did it. Hooray. Even more impossible. Okay, we're going to make it even more impossible. I'm going to have a chocolate break. Who wants chocolate? Chocolate. Oh, I don't think I can throw that far. I got it. Do you want chocolate? Okay. Right, even more impossible. Where's this one? Okay, so if we want to add and delete things, it can be a little bit awkward. So right here, we've got like a table with all of our cards on. And if we click on the table, those cards are shuffling. And if we click on this little magic ball, it's going to add a card to the table. And if we click on the card, it's going to get rid of it. So let's do a little flip. And you can see that it works for the cards that are on the table. That's great. But if you try and get rid of one, it just flashes out. Because in order to flip between two states, you need two states. And entering things aren't going to be there at the beginning of the flip. And things that are leaving aren't going to be there at the end of the flip. So it ruins the whole thing. So, sorry, I have to go look at my notes. So we can do this with callbacks. So we've got some handy callbacks, and you can say, like, on enter, and then we get to call a little function, and we can say, just use a GSAP tween. So we're going to say from, because we're animating something in. And we are going to target, we need to pass in elements. That's what we need to do. Elements. And we're going to animate it in from opacity. Oh gosh, typing is hard. And we'll do a little rotation too. We'll do a little spin. You gonna work? Hooray! So that's animating elements in, and GSAP's like, okay, this wasn't here at the beginning of the flip, but you want us to handle it in some way and also add it to the group of the rest of the flipped elements. And then we can do the same thing with on leave. So we're going to say on leave. We'll do a GSAP 2 because we're animating to a place rather than from a place. And now we can add, and we can shuffle, and we can get rid of elements. So it's really handy. So it's on leave, it's a little bit of a tricky thing to do, because obviously if you just remove something from the DOM, it doesn't exist, so you can't animate it. So the way that we've got around this is you add display none to your elements that you want to get rid of. So you just add display none, and then GSAP's flip plugin is like, oh, okay, cool, you want to get rid of that, so we'll pass it through to the onLeave function. So I also know I've said that the whole purpose of using the flip technique is to avoid layout reflows, and obviously avoid layout reflows as much as you can. But it's also worth noting that it depends. So sometimes if you're dealing with stuff like border radius, it can do stuff like that. And if you're dealing with containers that have text in it, can sometimes do text reflows. And I've done some pretty mad things in the past with like clip paths and all sorts of stuff to try and get around this. But if you do have to animate width or height for some reason, just be careful and make sure that you do testing. But sometimes it is just a thing that you have to do. Also here we've got these these inside elements that are being flipped to just wildly flailing all over the place. And that's because we're not actually just flipping here, we are flip-flopping. So we're animating both the parent and the children. So you can say nested true. And this is the stuff that's like the tricky thing to do with vanilla JS. If you say nested true, it flips the parent and the children, which is really handy. So yeah, flip-flop. So it's first, last, invert, play on the parent, and then the children, you have to do the first and the last measurement, and then you have to calculate the offset from the parent. So a little bit fiddly. So yeah, now that I've told you about Flip, I hope you'll see use cases for it everywhere. Really great one is for page transitions. This is by Sarah Drasner. It's like a classic using Vue Transition Group. I also popped together this little demo. It's not as nice as Sarah's, but it's using Vue Router and Flip, if anyone wants to have a little look at that. And also, Jake Archibald's been sharing some really exciting things about the shared element transition API, which is coming to Chrome. So Jay's going to be chatting about this a little bit tomorrow, I think. And also, it's not just for UI transitions. It's like a really helpful mental model to have when you're animating on the web, whatever it is that you're animating. So I did this little header for ESLint, and the cursor comes from a fixed position at the top of the screen, and it animates down to that drop-down. But obviously, depending on the screen size, the drop-down's in a completely different place. So I just structured a GSAP timeline, sequenced the animations, and then when it gets to a certain point in the timeline, I just call the flip animation, and it switches between the two of them. So it's just really helpful. I'm going to leave you with a last message. I hope you find the flip animation technique useful for future projects, but remember to use your magical powers responsibly. Big swipey layout shifts can be nauseating for people with vestibular disorders. I actually have had one of them. I had an inner ear infection, and I couldn't look at animation. It made me feel really sick. So if the animation is an important, integral part of explaining the interface, make sure you don't just get rid of it. Make sure you do like a simple opacity fade. And then if it's just decorative, you can just get rid of it. Oh no. Oh, okay, I'm just gonna grab this quickly. Buddy, I'm doing a conference talk. Can we chat later? You wanna say hi? Okay, say hi. Okay, bye, bud. Bye. Sorry about that. Sorry. So yeah, as I was saying, use your magical powers responsibly, and that's the lot. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, okay. First question, more Brody, please. Can we have more Brody, please? Amazing. That's so great. I love seeing like how playful this is, but also knowing that you can extrapolate that and start using that in really kind of interesting and very functional and kind of enriching ways.
Yeah,
But the thing that
definitely.
blows my mind is how little code that seemed to be for you for what you were achieving. But a question that has come up in a couple of different channels is just, I think, the imagining that over time as you're building things that are more and more complex and moving from, you know, your very concise examples. How do you, have you got any tips for trying to troubleshoot animations as you're building them up and trying to debug things? Because, I mean, you've described how, oh, there are some little gotchas and this is how we get around them. And I imagine that you might bump into those wrinkles as you go. So are there any
Yeah.
good tips for
My
techniques on
tip
that?
is what I say to people about 20 times a day in the GSAP forums, and that is minimal demo, please.
Right.
So if you're struggling with animation, like the best thing to do is just take that animation out and just look at it in isolation, check that it's working, and then start layering things in and see where it breaks.
Yeah.
There's also Chris Gannon. He's like a really amazing animator, and he's made a scrubber. It's like a little timeline scrubber, and it's really neat and tidy. And if you're using GSAP timelines, you can just kind of move your cursor across the screen, and it plays it through and reverses it and
Nice.
stuff, which is really, useful.
And there's another question which feels like it's a little bit related, and I wonder if it might be a similar answer, where people are asking about the process of getting the animation right, and not so much just debugging it, but also designing it right. You know, and do you find that it's like an additive process that works best, or do you have an idea in your head of, oh, I want to achieve this thing, and it might be very big and ambitious, and then you have to break it down and start? I'm kind of curious about the approach that's worked best for you for kind of designing the animations in the first place.
It really depends on the project. I was saying this to my workshop people yesterday. Sometimes the best process is just to get stuck in and tweak things and try and make something, and you stumble upon cool stuff along the way. Other times, like, I'll write down almost like pseudocode for animations. Before I get started, so I'll be like, I want to do this, and then this, and then. And then also other times I'm like working with illustrators or designers or other motion designers, and there's like a lot more feedback involved. The ES Lint site that was designed by someone else, and I got an animation mock-up. And then had to figure out how to do that in code, which was tricky because like that little cursor thing in like After Effects, that's really easy, but on the web, it's a lot more complicated.
I feel like I've seen the expressions on front-end engineers' faces sometimes just like scrunch up when they've been shown this beautiful, like, this is very easy in this tool, do it in that tool now and make it work in an environment that we've no idea what it is. And so I guess in the same way that, you know, various JavaScript libraries in the past have kind of normalized things for JavaScript developers as browser APIs have kind of evolved. I guess that's what GSAP is doing, right? And that's kind of just normalizing that, so you've got like something that runs in lots of places. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of GSAP's plugins, like, again, I was chatting to workshop peeps yesterday, but there's like motion path plugin, which allows you to animate stuff along a motion path, but that's kind of coming now.
Right.
It's like already out in some browsers, and there's Morph SVG, which allows you to like morph shapes, and you can do morphing now. You have to have a specific number of points, like exactly matching, so it's a little limited.
Yeah.
But it's kind of all of the things that you can do with GSAP are kind of gradually shifting into the web. Even the shared element transition API.
Yeah.
Which is exciting.
Nice. I noticed there's another. Hang on a sec. Lovely. Yeah. Mm. I
Gonna be finding
I'll
them.
be honest. I got loads of these. I got them. Oh no!
Don't ruin the magic.
Don't ruin it. We sucked them in. Is that all of them? I'm sure there's going to be more. There was a question about legibility and kind of accessibility as well, because it feels like depending on what kind of animations are being used and for what purpose, they might have different accessibility and kind of impacts. Are there any kind of good yardsticks or any kind of guiding principles for how you just be a good citizen for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at any sites that I've done animation on, they don't have any animating in text on scroll, that kind of thing. That's like the classic. People are always coming up to me and being like, oh, animation's bad for accessibility. And they're talking about that kind of animation. Animation where people are whizzing things around for no reason. It's not bringing any delight to the page, and it's not helping the user whatsoever. It's just like slowly fading in some text as you scroll down.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating. So I like to think like, is this adding something that will make someone smile? And is this helping guide the user in some way around the interface? And if it's not doing either of those, then there's probably not much point in animating.
Yeah, it feels like there was a trend a few years ago where I think everyone who worked at an agency was tapped on the shoulder and said, "We're going to have a parallax."
Yes.
Right? And there was an intake of breath around the room when I used the word parallax. But it does also seem, and I poo-pooed that. You know, I was like, this is really bad for all of these reasons, and the performance is often really, really bad. But it feels like some of that is coming back in a more tasteful way now, and I don't know if it's maybe just I've relaxed. And it's like, oh, it doesn't matter because I like the eye candy. Or is it that we've got more responsible ways of implementing that now, and people are using a bit more discretion? Have you got any opinions on that?
I kind of feel like there's a place for all kinds of animation, because websites do loads of different things for loads of different people.
Yeah.
And you just kind of have to know your target audience and know your brand and kind of work out whether it's appropriate. Because obviously you're not going to want, like on Vitaly's site, great having a little prawn with like wiggly antennas, but you wouldn't have that on your bank website.
I don't know. I think that's a challenge for all of us. Get a prawn with wiggly antennas onto all of our sites. I've got one last question, and then we'll let you go. So if people are at the start of their journey and they've been doing other aspects of web development, but now they are interested in starting to experiment with animation, have you got any kind of tips for what would be your first step? What's the first way you would play an experiment or start getting involved? Have you got any thoughts for that?
Yeah, I really love SVG as a way to start. Like, they're images that you can manipulate with code. Like, what is there not to love? And you can download vector images from like FreePic or icons from Noun Project, or you can hit up a designer that you work with and get an SVG.
Right. Yeah.
And it's how I learned JavaScript, actually, because I was just messing around with SVG animations using like SMIL and CSS.
Yeah.
And then I heard about this green sock thing, and I was like, oh, that's cool, but JavaScript's a bit scary. And then that was just like the gateway drug, I guess, into...
I love it.
Now I do lots of JavaScript.
Yeah, that was the way in. I've only just realized, I feel like an idiot, I've only just realized that your suit matched your playing cards.
Yes, it did. I matched my demos. I'm also very hot right now, but
yes, it is
I
roasting.
look great. So
it's roasting. It was worth that. We appreciate your sacrifice. We judge all of the other speakers who have not matched their wardrobe to their slides design. We expect better tomorrow. All right. Thank you so much for a wonderful way to finish the day.
Thank
a
you
big
for
round of
having
applause
me.
for Cassie Evans. Thanks, Cassie. Awesome.